Okay. Want to welcome everybody to the Deep Row Entrenchment webinar, Deep Row Entrenchment of Biosolids using hybrid poplar. This has been a three-part webinar series. This webinar series has three presentations. My name is Jonathan Kays. I am the kind of filling in as host today for our usual host, Andrew Kling, who is here today. But on behalf of myself and Gary Felton, who are making this presentation today, we welcome you. And for those of you who may have been here last week, we talked about the basic deep row entrenchment technique, about why I'm here, what you basically need to know, and about the research that's been done. Today, we're going to be focusing on the nuts and bolts of this technique and things to consider to get it done correctly. Next week at 2 o'clock, on Wednesday, we'll be talking, Gary Felton will be doing that program, talking about the protection of water quality and monitoring options for deep row entrenchment. This webinar is being recorded and it will be available on our website at go.umd.edu/woodland, where the other webinars will be as well, free of charge and accessible. We will send out a notice after it's all over, along with an evaluation. And participants are coming in muted and the video is off. So we ask that you keep it that way unless we ask you to do otherwise. And if you have a comment or a question, please use the chat box at the bottom of the screen. And the way we're going to handle this is, keep the questions until the end, and I will be facilitating the questions for Gary and myself. So that's how we're going to handle the questions. Two speakers, as you see here, are myself, Jonathan Kays, a forestry specialist, and Gary Felton, who is a water quality specialist with the University of Maryland. I've been with the University of Maryland for a number of years. We both have in our own specialties, and we both bring something to this project. And that's what we're going to share today as we talk about the nuts and bolts of deep row entrenchment. So, Gary, can you see my screen as it is?
It looks great. Let's go.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. Again, we're going to be talking about the importance of getting this done right. A lot of what we're going to talk about today, most all of it really, was included in a new 48-page bulletin that's available online with our other publications. So in terms of an overview, we're going to talk about deep row entrenchment as a nutrient management system, some objectives that's going to dictate some of the techniques used, site prep, including soils and monitoring, and tree planting techniques, clone selection, irrigation and vegetation management, and harvesting and reapplication. Sounds like quite a bit, and it is. So we're going to move along this pretty quickly. For those of you, I hope were here last week, the basic idea of the dynamics of deep row application is putting biosolids under the ground in this low oxygen, high water, low temperature anaerobic environment, basically with overburden, and then utilizing nutrient demanding hybrid poplar trees to utilize the nutrients, typically in the work that we did, in somewhere in the 6 to 8 year range. This is all based on a budget that was developed by the Urco Tree Farm back in 1983. I'm not going to really go into the details except to say that nitrogen comes in many forms, in terms that some of it's going to be immobilized, some is going to be put back in the atmosphere, some's going to be utilized by the trees, and that's balanced against the amount of biosolids that are put in the ground in terms of the nutrient base. So this is a system that depends on two things. It depends on basically in this more sterile environment, if you want to call it, of a reclamation site, where you have the nutrients coming from the material put in, trees taking up. So you have to have both parts of this. So look at this as a system that works with nutrients in and nutrients out, and proper application of biosolids is really part of that. In terms of mounding or flattening it out are some options, and consistent depth. But what's really critical is that you have sufficient tree stocking of these nutrient demanding trees that's going to utilize the nitrogen in those biosolids at the rate is what is expected. So site planning depends on a number of things. techniques, it's going to affect the techniques used on the landowner objectives. There's going to be an assessment additionally for deer damage potential, which is something that changed at the site we are working on over the years. It became much more difficult to grow. Is there a need for irrigation? In terms about access and roads, especially if it's going to be done during the wintertime, is that available? Is this going to be a one-time application or a plan for multiple rotations? And I do hear some background noise. I think somebody please make sure you're muted. I appreciate that. Thank you very much. Also, there's going to be permit approvals, and it's the whole idea of proper equipment and adequately trained personnel, whether it's for equipment, if there's going to be fencing or pesticides used or herbicides, and so on. So just using the site that we worked out with ERCO as an example, which was about 100 acres or so, with 10-acre blocks, with a number of monitoring wells. You can see where our research site was there. I'm just going to use the operational slides because this was an operational site. I mean, this was a business that was depending upon incoming in, expenses, and so on, with our research site located in there. So this is from what we're working with. And from that, we'll kind of describe other applications to other types of reclamation sites, so the coal and so on and so forth. The application rights that we tested were 3, 172, 345, and 517 dry tons per acre. We found basically from the research that even operationally, the only 2 that were really possible in real context for the first 2. And in terms of environmentally, with water quality and just operationally, and I think Gary can go into that later when he talks about that at the final webinar. But this is the basic process, digging a trench, depending upon the rate of biosolids would dependent upon the depth and maybe how close the trenches were. And lime stabilized biosolids brought in by truck. As you can see, volatilizing there, waiting right alongside the trench where the bulldozer comes along, and a fairly experienced operator here, obviously making this happen correctly, putting the proper amount in, and then taking soil from the trench that was dug up and putting it back over the top, so immediately it becomes anaerobic with no oxygen provided. So that's the basic technique, and then you have this kind of mounded application site, which was then graded out. And this is a big difference I'll mention a little bit later, is that between how some people are utilizing this, that they are, are you leveling out the site or allowing these mounds to persist? So with that, I am going to switch over to Gary, who is going to talk a little bit about soils and that aspect. So I am going to stop sharing.
I'm going to talk a little bit about the soil requirements. In fact, that's what I'm going to focus most on. And then I'm just going to talk a little bit about planning for monitoring before you dig the first shovelful. It's so much easier to do if you plan it ahead of time than if you try to retrofit a monitoring system to some sites. Some you can get away with it pretty easily. So on the left-hand side of this drawing, we see something called soil. On the right hand is spoil. So when I talk about layers of topsoil, subsoil, and something that's below that, can go by many different names. Some call it sea horizon. It can be called regolith. It can be called part of the vadose zone. It's got different labels. But when we talk about these labels, let's talk about an ideal soil. One that would be, or spoil, an ideal spoil that would be just perfect for putting DRE on. Well, first, I'd want a topsoil that holds water. It's got to provide a suitable environment for the hybrid poplar tree roots. And this is where the plants are going to first start growth. The first year, it's going to get all its water and all of its nutrients out of this little 12-inch layer in the top of the spoil. In this particular soil, or porous media, oxygen has to be able to get in at least a little bit. You need some oxygen moving in there. The roots are not well developed enough yet, so it's got to be able to get oxygen. If we move a little deeper, we're going to this subsoil. Well, in a soil, that would be 6 to 48 inches. In a spoil, this subsoil could start at 0. I mean, that could be the only thing we have. And it goes down to about 48 inches. And what we want in this particular area is something that holds water. It doesn't have to be nutrient rich. It can be pretty sterile. The nutrient content may diminish with depth, as is common in some places. The roots have to be able to penetrate the soil. One of the things that happens with the use of heavy equipment is sometimes soil can be compacted so tight that the roots simply can't penetrate. The roots are necessary because they access both water and they anchor the trees in place. If you only had roots in the top 12 inches when the trees started to get taller and taller and taller, we'd have a rainstorm come along with a lot of wind and the soil would get wet and the trees would blow over. That's not really what we want. We want the oxygen restricted enough that below this subsoil or in this subsoil, everything will go anaerobic. Now in spoil, there just might not be any topsoil, so it may be that we're just talking about a subsoil layer and the trees would actually go at this brown line right here. Finally, we have stuff below that. And that could be 48 inches plus. 4 to 7 feet of this material. We need this between 4 feet to 7 or 4 feet to 90 would be fine. 90 feet of this material would be good because this material is basically clay. That's what we're looking for. We do not want water moving through it very fast, and we don't want oxygen that penetrates it. So if you're on a coal mine that's been done in, say, eastern Kentucky, where they blasted rock, that's not the kind of spoil you get. So that creates lots of additional problems. If you're in western Kentucky, it's exactly what you get. The western Kentucky coal mines are basically built on a coastal, no, not a coastal plain, but a river bottom. That's part of the Mississippi River Valley. And they have clay, pretty tight clay, below 4 or 5 feet. The importance of clay. Well, in topsoil, some clay content is fine. Some sand is okay in the topsoil. In the subsoil, we gotta have clay. It's gotta be a significant content, one that slows water down, one that keeps oxygen from flowing easily, or actually air from flowing easily. Now, some fine sand is okay if it's sandy clay loam or a sandy clay. Below, we prefer clay. If it's just plain old marine clay like we have at the Urco site, that's ideal. If you have coarse sand in any of the top 2 layers, you're going to have nitrogen pollution. So coarse sand is something that you must look at it and say, this site is not for what we want to do. You just don't do DRE on a coarse sand. We did a research project in Virginia and showed that pretty conclusively. It just poured nitrogen out of the soil. When we talk about monitoring, I've just switched gears now, we're going to talk about some things that we monitor, and one of them could be water flow rate. If that's the case and that's necessary, that becomes a fairly complicated activity when you're going beneath the soil surface. So water flow measurement will take some pretty good instrumentation. Nutrient concentration we're used to measuring. We dig a well, we put a water sampler down, pull it up, take it into the lab, and they measure concentration for us. Nutrient load is not so easy. Nutrient load is basically the water flow rate at a point in time multiplied by that nutrient concentration at a point in time. And so what you'll get in a nutrient load may be pounds of nitrogen per year. That's the kind of thing that we worry about in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And if that's part of the permit variables, then you've got quite a monitoring issue. It's not going to be impossible, but it is going to be tough, and you got to have good equipment, and you're going to have more maintenance on the equipment. So when you plan your monitoring, it's important to know what the geology is that you're looking at. Is it rock? Is it a porous media of sand, silt, clay, that sort of thing? Which of those two, basically, will determine the kind of monitoring you're going to have to do. What are the permit requirements? And that means what variables, what frequency. Is assessment required? And when I mean assessment, I mean taking the results of the monitoring and drawing conclusions. So that means you have to do possibly some calculations and possibly use some judgment calls. Is the monitoring for research, or is it permitting, or is it both? If the monitoring is just for permitting, you may only need concentrations. That's pretty easy in porous media. You drill a well, take a sample, you've got a concentration. If it's for research, you're probably going to want to know nitrogen flow rates and phosphorus flow rates, although the phosphorus is probably not going to move much at all. In that case, you want to plan your monitoring careful, and you want to plan it on paper before you start the operation. You send that idea to the permitting agency informally. You don't submit a permit. You just send it to them and say, does this look okay? Get the permitting agency to work with you and give you ideas of what they'd like to see. Changes that an agency might want can easily be made on paper, but it sure can be awful tough once you've started putting in instrumentation. It turns out they wanted something different. So at this point, I'm going to stop sharing, turn this over to Jonathan again, and we'll be done with our dancing back and forth between the two of us.
Thanks, Gary. Very helpful.
If you have any questions, don't forget the chat box.
Yeah, we'll be gathering the questions for the end of our time together. So this leads to maybe some options that relate to the objectives that are determined by the whole site in general. But again, I've been to some sites, especially on coal mines, where you've kind of left the elevated rows up there, compared to the way I know that was done at ERCO site, was to kind of level off the site. And that's kind of a determination, but I guess I would just say in general, this is prior to some type of planting, that by having a level site, you have a whole lot more options with regards to maintenance, to accessing it for whether you're mowing or using herbicide, whether you're going to do any type of irrigation. It's just much easier to work across the site. And I would argue that probably to do that requires also, very good equipment operators that can plow off that layer such that they're going to be able to do it in a way that you have that overburden at a kind of a consistent level. But again, having it flat is going to leave more options for you as the landowner. Now, if there's not going to be any additional rotations or anything, then maybe that's okay. But again, something to consider. Okay, I guess I had 2 slides with grading options. Apologize. So again, this was kind of a repeat of the other one, the elevated rows versus level site grading. This was a slide really intended to make that difference and showing a few examples on the lower left, the site where again it was not graded flat. If it is going to be flat, and again if it's going to be any type of slope, it's really important to put in erosion control. In some cases, you can see on this slide in the upper right where a water channel is developing and going to erode away that overburden layer. Different tree planting methods are available for sure. At ERCO, initially a lot of the planting was done with crews like this using a planter on the back of a tractor. And the old way is actually, as you see on the lower left there, with Gary actually demonstrating how to use a planting bar making a hole and then inserting the stecking. And really what we're talking about here was using steckings, spring planting, right after the last frost as early as possible. And these can be purchased or they can be produced as well in production beds like you see on the lower right there, because they do get expensive. You order them from a producer, they're going to probably have to be overnighted, which is expensive, and the cost can be. So again, you're talking about small cuttings from first year growth, and they can be produced from production beds like this. And I've seen places where they're doing that because there is a significant cost savings involved. At the Urco site, basically a subsoiler was used that once the site was graded to break it up. And you can see on the upper right there, the actual ripper that was used. So it went down, I don't know, about 10, 12 inches, something like that. It was actually done on a grid pattern of 10 by 10, and where those intersected, a stecking was put in. It didn't even need a planting bar because the soil was all loose. And this is very, very good because it provided a really good substrate for the stecking for it to grow and for the roots to expand.
The ripper bar was just bolted onto the front end of the bulldozer blade.
That's correct. And actually, I don't think I had a picture of it, but they had a, it was on a tractor. They actually had bars out to the side, so they kept that 10-foot spacing. They could just kind of follow it along. So this kind of shows what it looks like close up along with the stecking. Now realize this is impossible on all sites and applications, and it may not be necessary. It's really going to depend on the soil. Some of these sites that have large rocks, it might not make it possible, but it is something to consider. Just to give you an idea, I can't reiterate enough how the first year after the site's prepared and you're ready to plant, that is your best opportunity to establish the trees. After that, it gets a lot more difficult. And we saw this just from some of the work we did. When the research plots we had, we could not do any ripping or subsoiling because of all the instrumentation. And you can see that survival after 1 year, that the survival was much better compared to those areas where there was no subsoiling, and the height growth as well was much better. Also, we had a lot more browsing because the trees, once they need to get about 5.5 foot tall to get out of the reach of the deer. So there was just a lot more browsing as well. So again, first year is the best chance. You want to put all your effort into that to make it work, whatever it takes in terms of site prep and effort. And that would go for deer fencing, as I'll mention later, as well as potential irrigation being set up for that if it was necessary. So why is good for about survival essential? Okay, again, you have the system. You have nutrient demanding hybrid poplars essential to the breakdown and the uptake of the nutrients across the entire site where the biosolids are put. They're going to find the trenches where the biosolids are. You don't have to plant on top of the rows. Actually, that's what we found. Worked really, was no effort to do that. But the problem is that other vegetation that may come in, even trees, typically they're just shallow rooted. They're not going to fill the same function the hybrid poplar has. They're not going to have the capabilities for uptake. So again, when you don't have the trees, you don't have a complete system, and you're going to have biosolids just kind of sitting there with nothing really reaching them to any great extent. This is a picture from actually when Urco first started, and they were planting thousands of trees per acre after 6 months, but you can see they had very good planting success. This is a time when there really were no deer problems, and they had some good, good planting weather and not a lot of drought. After 6 years, let's see here. So the environmental benefits in general, I don't maybe have to state, but even though this is is done on a rotating basis where you're clearing the land every 6 to 8 years, you still during those periods you have wildlife habitat, you have the opportunity for reclamation, so carbon sequestration, and of course just increased infiltration rather than water just running off into large erosion channels. And again, if this material is not being put into landfills, the extended life of the landfills that might be utilized for that purpose. So the parameters of reapplication for the original permit from ERCO was based on that nutrient model for nitrogen. And when the deep rows showed 70% mineralization of the biosolids, and the foliar leaf samples were less than 3.5% nitrogen. I have to check on that. I think it might have been 3.2%. I'm not sure about that. But basically, those were the parameters. And after that, the site could be harvested and reapplied. And just those parameters were used to indicate that the pack had been mineralized enough, that broken down enough that the site could be cleared and start over again.
Those two parameters were written into the permit.
Correct, right. That was and I think we've mentioned this, but ERCO was established on a research permit, and the Department of Environment could determine what those parameters were, and that was a couple of them, correct? I believe. So this is a picture, and Gary, maybe you want to comment on this based on your slide with the overburden and what we're looking at there.
Okay, this is a picture that shows the clay that we had. Because it's been open for a while, the clay is just a little bit more yellow. It actually starts out with kind of a green hue when you first expose it. And that clay, in this case, went down, according to the Geological Survey, about 90 feet. Above this is overburden, and that's material that may have gotten moved around during the mining operation. This was a sand and gravel mine. The sand and gravel was actually rolling hills above a pretty good layer of clayey soils. And so the overburden you see is the remnant of that sand and gravel, mostly clayey soils. And this has probably been pushed around where we are at least one time before. So it's not just dropped there, it's been moved because of grading it and regrading it again for a reapplication. That kind of brown line you see is mineralized biosolids. It always appears sort of as a smiley face. For some reason, it turns up at the two sides of the trench. And so this is a cut across a previous trench. And you can see at this point, what was 18 inches of biosolids is now down to maybe 6 inches. This is a picture highlighted with some red spray paint about how the roots are growing. And in the top picture, you can see the roots are not going straight down. These roots were over top of a trench, and they grew around it, but only very slowly grew into it. Basically, when the biosolids are put in, that's a pretty toxic mixture down there of lots of sulfurs. The pH is at first, it's at about 11 or 12. And so it takes a while for that pH to get tamed. And so the roots go around it, but they do pull water out of it, and they begin to work their way into it as the material in there begins to age. That one root we see there is one that's going pretty much straight down. I'm sorry that the other root we had isn't here, because there was a root that just made a right turn and went about 6 feet to the right till it got to the biosolids pack. And you can see we've dug out the remnant biosolids from the previous trenching on the right-hand side.
So, one component of this is, as we talk about this, it's a little bit difficult for some to understand, and I think for a lot of regulators, this was something very unusual, as well as even for folks I dealt with at forestry and elsewhere. So we had a number of field days. I can't remember how many years we had field days, but we had a lot of them. And this is just some pictures of some of them, and Gary talking, in one of the trenches, talking about what's going on. That shovel on the upper right is actually some of the biosolid material that's been decomposed, and it's kind of like peat moss at this point. And I think, seeing is believing for a lot of these folks that saw this, but had a lot of profound influence on people, I think, who visited the tree farm.
I want to add here that we found out something interesting. One of our field days invited the people from the surrounding neighborhoods, because we had neighborhoods near us, to come in. And when they came in and they began to see and hear what was going on, they became a lot more amenable to their neighbors. It helped with public relations with them because one of the ladies said, "That's what that sound I keep hearing is." And what she'd been hearing was when the truck pulled away from dumping the biosolids, he always slammed on the brakes so that his gate would slam up against the truck and empty the biosolids out of both the bed that was tilted and off the tailgate. And she just didn't know what that noise was, and she felt much better when she understood it. Okay, John.
And they also understood that there really was no odor or smell from the biosolids, which would not be the case if this was all surface applied. So again, this is just another workshop that was held probably around those 7-year period. So on this particular site, after it reached the parameters of the permit, the site could be harvested and then reapplied, and that was cleared. The material was rounded up, had to be removed from site based on the permit. It couldn't be left there, which would actually be a good thing if it was just going to be chipped and left. The stumps were removed, the site was graded, and then it was ready for reapplication, of which the new application would be done perpendicular to the existing trench. And some of these sites have been done, were under third rotation. So some of the management changes I may have mentioned that based on when we started working with this, with ERCO, was the density of trees. They were using over 2,700 trees per acre. Of course, working with forestry, the idea is you can have smaller number of trees and just put more biomass at a tree, makes it more manageable, and makes it possible to produce a larger diameter product, which is going to be easier to harvest and utilize. And that's what was done. And also access for mowing and everything else you can imagine. Again, we talked at the first webinar about why hybrid poplar, but extremely fast growing. It's taking up a lot more nitrogen compared to native species. The turnover in roots, the root tips that provide oxygen to aid in conversion of nitrogen into nitrate. Again, there's been a lot of work done with hybrid poplar here in the Pacific Northwest. It's part of many systems that are out there. And the other change we made was in terms of the operational clone that was used. And that was based on clonal trials. I briefly mentioned this on the first one. I'm provide a little more detail, but the first clone that was being used widely for many years, a couple decades actually, I think, 15 years, was this HP 308. And based on the clonal trials that we did, we found the best performer to be this OP 367. So much higher height in the same period of time. That just means everything, because you're producing more biomass, you're utilizing the nutrients faster in the biosolids, you're cutting the turnaround of the rotations. And of course, if you're doing multiple rotations, that allows you to have a higher profit margin on that property. And just to show you some of the clones that were used, these were the listings here. This shows total height, and this was done for 4 years. And you can see that OP 367, after the end of 4 years, that has that star on top of it in 2004, was the highest one that was there. But pretty close was this DN17, both significantly taller than most of the others. But it's not all just about growth, it's also about survival. And when you start to look at the survival of the two, you see that the OP 367, almost all of them lived, compared to only about less than 50% of the others. So that made that the obvious choice. And so the conclusions, like I said, the OP 367 was the best performer, 96% in total height after 5 years. DN17, good growth, height growth, but poor survival. So again, the OP 367 has been the one that's been used for many years. And it's been used on a lot of the coal mines as well, work that's been done in Pennsylvania and Ohio. Factors affecting the growth and survival, poor survival after a lot of replantings on our research plots. We weren't really able to get much great data out of the density sides of the research. But the reasons for that, for this case, was, again, we feel that site preparation on the research site was not possible. That was a great factor. But we also had heavy deer browse. We had a couple of years of significant drought mixed in there during the research, which also just did not help at all. And to give you an idea of that, of how that worked out, you can see that in the research plot itself, from these four years, height growth and biomass growth was much less than what you've seen in the operational area from 1999 to 2005. So just a profound difference. And again, for the three main reasons that are mentioned there. Site planting at the time is important, and deer browsing is critical. In later years, in the research we were doing, there was a lot of development going on, not that far away, and you can see this newly planted site right here in the top, and this is at the end of one growing season. The only thing growing there was weeds. The deer had just chowed down everything. So, without, of course, that sets everything back. It's an expense. It makes regeneration basically or afforestation impossible. So in areas where deer is a problem, and this is something that should be assessed up front, that this operation really would not be feasible without deer. And that may not be the case on a lot of areas where you have in coal mine areas where there's not as many deer and things like that. The other question is, well, deer fencing is expensive. What about tree shelters? We did tree shelters at the ERCO on some areas, and I didn't have great results, but they are used other areas. And I think that there are some newer products out there as well. Some of the tree shelters now actually have ventilation in them. Because what we found is in some of the tubes at 4 or 5 foot tall that they built up such high temperatures, they just roasted the seedlings. So the thing about tree shelters is they're a blessing and a curse. They can be quite expensive when you start looking at over time, and then the maintenance involved. So that might have to be compared against the cost of some initial fencing that might last for a few years. And I'll show you a picture of one of those products. But you can see here, some of these holes were filled in by trees within tree shelters. So different types of deer fencing. I've done a lot of work with deer fencing, and this black plastic fencing that you see on the lower right is very popular. 8 foot tall, it's put up with posts, and you basically put a wire at the top, in the middle, and the bottom, and you kind of hang the fencing. But there's all kinds of newer products like you see on the left here, and with that hand on top, they're actually plastic coated wire. Still going to be an expense, no question about it. But again, I guess my message to you is, if in site assessment aspects, if deer are going to be an issue, then you need to make that part of your business model, part of the cost of doing business. And there's a number of options on how to do it, like I've mentioned. So irrigation, that first year is especially very critical. We tried to do a little bit of irrigation. I think Gary actually was involved with that, using a tanker truck, right, and some irrigation pipe and things like that. But there are, trickle irrigation systems out there that can be utilized, but they would require, again, considering that in your site plan. Do you have adequate slope on site for some type of a gravity feed? I should say gravity feed. Of course, there's cost and labor involved. You need a water source, probably a tank. Well would be much more expensive at the top of that, the top of that slope. And then when you do irrigation, you must do vegetation management. I mean, you have to kill the weeds around that. Plenty of research shows that if you put irrigation on, when you don't control the competing vegetation, you just get bigger competing vegetation.
I'm going to stop for just a moment because we have questions from a couple of people that I think I need to answer.
Sure.
This area is in Lower Prince George's County, Maryland. It is pretty much due east of Washington, D.C., roughly 7 miles east. It's in the outer edge of the no-fly zone, if you want to be specific about it. That's all I was going to cover. I see some stuff from Bill McMahon, but we'll come to that later. He's got a couple of good points there. Go ahead, Jonathan. Sorry.
No problem. Thanks for answering those. So again, I guess the point is, like all things, in a site plan before starting an operation like this, you'd want to look at irrigation, because again, if you lost all those seedlings because of drought, that'd be a big setback. Okay. We did some work with vegetation management, a little study we did there on some 4-year-olds, and you can see vegetation management here, just to mow it, spraying strips, which was, quite effective. We tried to do a limited study on the effect of vegetation management, as well as applying phosphorus on some 4-year-old trees in a replicated study. And this is in our other materials. I'm not going to go into a lot of this because what happened is we did it for 2 years. The second year we had incredible drought, which basically made it difficult to pick out any differences because nothing really grew. But what we found out when we did vegetation management, we had sites like this where we would kill the vegetation, okay? But by the end of the growing season, a lot of this material had grown back. So we were using things like glyphosate, which is a broadcast killer. But I think that a lot of tree plantings I've been involved with, we use a pre-emergent herbicide primarily in many ways, because that would stop anything new from germinating throughout the beginning of the growing season and give those seedlings a much better idea, a much better chance of succeeding, especially in that late summer window when moisture becomes very critical. So there's a lot here, and I'm not going to go into a lot of the details here to say, except that we had a control, we did vegetation management, we added phosphorus, and then we did some that had vegetation management and phosphorus. And the only thing I would say is, because some of these were significant, some of them weren't, but in general, if you look at the controls and look at the height, the diameter, and the biomass, what you tend to notice is that with the vegetation and phosphorus treatments combined, you saw increases. Okay, some of these were significant and some of them weren't, like after 2 years. So if you go like 0 to 2 years, you go from 3.4 here of meters tall to 3.9. For diameter, 5.5 to 6. Biomass increases. Again, not necessarily some of them significant, some are not. But the point is that I think this is an area where some more work could be done. We would have gotten, I think, better results again if that second year from 1 to 2 we had seen had a lot more moisture, but it was a complete drought. So we had some improvements with just vegetation management and phosphorus, but again, in general, I think that we could say that the phosphorus and vegetation treatments had the greatest increase in height, and diameter, and biomass, although they weren't significant. And the severe drought during the year 2 masked, I think, a lot of those differences that we might have seen. And the results indicate that more operational field studies are needed. We know from a lot of forestry studies that certainly vegetation management is going to be effective, especially in these environments where you have limited moisture. Now, these trees are living off what's in the pack, but as they get to the extent that they are now in those larger sizes, surface and moisture and stuff that seeps down is going to be helpful for sure. And also the impact of those treatments on rotation length may be cost effective, because if you get higher growth rates, those trees can be turned around on a faster schedule. Even if you save a year, that can make a big difference. And again, this is assuming this is going to be on a rotational basis, and many of these applications are not necessarily, that's not the objective of them. It's just a one-time application. Some real basics of vegetation management, again, is that in most of the work that we did at ERCO, there was not much use of herbicides. It was just mowing to control vegetation. And on other sites I've been to in Pennsylvania, Ohio, very similar. If there is any, there's no real herbicides being used. But I think it'll greatly be a great asset. There's no doubt in my mind. You can see on this lower figure here, this is actually Japanese knotweed. and some of these sites just totally infested. And once this material takes over, nothing else can grow. And again, if you don't have the stocking of the hybrid poplar, it's a big problem. Where this becomes very critical is in cases where you may have regeneration failure or planting failure in that first year. And then you have to go back and replant the second year. And I've seen the cases where steckings are being planted in like what you see on top here. There's no way those things are going to survive, and they don't. So if you are going to use steckings again and do a replant in the second year, you have to manage that, get rid of that vegetation, either mechanically by scalping off the tops of the trenches or whatever, or by the use of herbicide, which would probably be a whole lot easier to do. The herbicides, require employees to have a commercial forest pesticide applicators license for the state they operate in. There's a couple of main herbicides that are used for broadcast application. There's glyphosate, Roundup is one of the trade names of that, and triclopyr, which Garlon is one of the trade names. But there's also pre-emergence, and ALIST is a very common one, sulfomethyl, furon methyl. And again, there's different ways to apply it, but on a commercial operation, it would make sense to have something like you see here with a UTV. But backpack sprayers can be effective as well. So I think my point is that from what I've seen, I don't see herbicides being used on deep row application sites that I've seen. And I think that it would greatly improve the survival of those first year seedlings, and certainly for anything planted the second year. So conclusions on growth and survival are that clone selection and access is important. First year planting success is essential. That overburden affects growth and survival. First year irrigation probably should be available if needed. And deer are a factor that need to be considered, and the plantings protected. And vegetation management and perhaps phosphorus amendments are beneficial. There's also aspects of iron that could be added as well. So with that said, the last couple of comments here is that, what about the harvesting and utilization? And again, it depends upon whether for the operation, is harvesting and utilization a consideration? Because I think some of the coal mine application sites might just be a one-time application to try and establish some good vegetation. And the fact is that there's thousands of acres of pre-1977 unclaimed coal spoils available out there. So it just depends on the objectives. But 68-year rotations are possible. They're going to produce small diameter trees, probably most useful for mulch or for wood chips for energy. And you can grow larger trees, but it's going to take definitely more additions of nutrients, either surface application of things. And we talked about that in the first webinar, but that would certainly be possible. But again, that would have to be part of the permit discussion, and maybe should be part of that permit discussion when the site is first assessed, to provide those options later on, even nothing else experimentally, to do some testing. So this is some of the material you see here, very small trees. In most cases, as long as you can get someone to come in and actually harvest the material on a break-even basis, you're going to be ahead than paying someone to do it. And at the Pacific Northwest and some other places, they've experimented growing trees larger to utilize them into trim boards and stuff like that. The costs, we do have a fact sheet on assessing the cost of deep row, and all the things that are there that you might want to consider are pretty obvious from a business perspective. You have revenue. Your biggest source of revenue is going to be from tipping fees for the biosolids. But is there a potential for the sale of forest products, or at least the break-even harvest of those products, so that you could reapply to the site? And in some cases, some places, the property tax assessments may be lower if they are in a managed forestry program. Not sure how that applies to coal spoils, but again, the other costs are the cost of site prep, installation, all the things that we've talked about, not to mention on-site monitoring. So this is going to vary for each one. And what we found from the study that we did of the ERCO site is that that lower rate of 172 wet tons per acre was marginal and really didn't have much profitability. The only profitability started to occur at the mid and high rate. And realistically, from our research, I think the high rate's probably not as problematic, but that mid rate is doable with regards to that it can be applied to the ground. So again, once you get to larger areas, a lot of this profitability and these models change. So the applications of research elsewhere is being used on old coal spoils that were mined prior to 1977. I've been to some of these up in Pennsylvania and Columbus. They all utilized our research to get these permits, but they're very different soils. And these are just some of the pictures of some of these sites and what they're looking at. You can see the size of some of this rock material, as well as a lot of very coarse material, which Gary might comment on. Again, but some of the other material, like you see here on the lower left, obviously there's clay in there, and that's a good thing. These trees are doing quite well. And then in many cases, they're just left mounded instead of being graded out. And again, with large rocks, and again, all these are different applications. The idea is to grow tree on this, and you can grow trees on this. This is a place in Ohio as well. So with that, we have plenty of time for questions. And again, I reiterate that the research that Gary Felton and I did was not possible without the use of the ERCO property and their invaluable assistance of their owners and staff. And special thanks to Eric Firmino and Scott Firmino and Mike Van Ham of Silvis Environmental up in BC that provided a lot of sound knowledge from their experience in the Pacific Northwest, and the funding we received from the Washington Suburban Sanitary Commission. And there were other partners as well. So with that, I think I will stop sharing. And I don't know if Gary, you want to field the questions? We have questions.
I'm going to let you field this first one. This one is from Bernie McMahon at UMD, which is University of Minnesota in Duluth. He says, number 2 sized cuttings are too small for field work due to competition and establishment energy of the mother stick, or what we call steckings. Deer and competing weeds are always an issue, as we all learn the hard way. And good site and quality adapted stock. That's his first comment.
Okay. So number 2, I'm trying to remember the actual diameter, the minimum diameter of the steckings. I thought they were somewhere in that area. I'm not sure what a number 2 size cutting is. I forget the actual dimensions. They're about 6 or 8 inches long, and maybe it was 9 inches. Like the minimum diameter was like, I don't know, 1/2 or 3/4 of an inch or something.
I believe it is about 3/8 of an inch, or at least that's what we got when we opened the box.
Okay. So I'm not sure if Bill has an additional comment. Oh, here he says 1/2 to 3/4 inch diameter are number 1s for field planting. I think that's basically what we were using, I believe.
And then I had a question for Jake, and this one looks like it's coming for me. Can you share more about what kind of nutrient applications might be required for growing wider spaced and larger trees over longer periods? What we put down is appropriate for growing the first 6 years. Jonathan, can you bring up the picture that is like the 3rd slide in your slide deck? In this biosolids pack that you should see here, we put down the amount of nitrogen that goes in there, but not all of that goes to the trees. And in fact, a whole lot of nitrogen goes somewhere else. When you have a nitrogenous material like organic nitrogen, which is what we have a lot of in biosolids, and it's put in a place where you can't get oxygen, it can break down to ammonia. But the microbes that are responsible for changing ammonia into nitrate just don't like anaerobic conditions, so they're not there. And the cool temperature keeps them from anything from acting too fast. So you end up without going to the nitrate form. The second thing that happens is that when you have nitrogen and carbon in an anaerobic condition, there's other microbes, anaerobes that are very happy in that condition, that they will take that nitrogen and they change it to some form of a nitrogen gas, whether it's NOx or N2, N2O. It's called denitrification. There was a study downtown, I think at the Smithsonian, a fellow named Taylor did it, and he showed that in the situation he had, 40% of his nitrogen was going into denitrification. So that only left 60% for everything else. So when you see the amounts, go to the next slide, please, Jonathan. When you see the amounts in this balance here, don't forget that hidden in that is a whole lot of nitrogen going into denitrification. And so the needs of the trees are about 540 pounds per acre. For supplementary nitrogen, that's what you would need. Whereas we were putting down about 1,000 pounds per acre. All you'd really need is 500. But that is the level you'd need. A couple of ways to do that. One way that would be really good if we'd all just start doing this sort of thing is to take wastewater treatment effluent, and instead of treating it to get all the nitrogen out of it, if we just use it for irrigation water. But we have a lot of issues with that right now, the way permits are written, and you got to get the water from the wastewater treatment plant all the way down to this tree farm. You can use water of any sort to move water into it, and you can inject nitrogen into it so that you could use trickle irrigation with nitrogen in it. And that would be another way to get nitrogen, get the nutrients to it. I don't know if that covers everything, Jake, but I'd have to sit down with a big envelope and do a lot of back of the envelope calculations to tell you how much larger trees would need per acre. But 500 pounds is a pretty good guess.
Thank you, Gary. That was really helpful.
Oh, good, good.
Yeah.
We have Lisa Challenger from Material Matters. I know her, or at least I know the company. If there are trees already growing, even if it is a mine spoil, would there be a justification for using DRHP method? Tell me what that is, Lisa.
I think that's the DRE. I think she means DRE method.
Okay, I'm not sure.
She means deep row with hybrid poplar, maybe.
Maybe that's it. Okay.
Yeah.
If there are trees already growing on the site and you want to just do reclamation, okay, thank you. If you want to just do reclamation, you're going to have to ask yourself if the trees are doing the job that you need. Are they stopping and intercepting rainfall? Are they preventing erosion? Are they stabilizing the soil? If they're doing that, then you probably don't need to add other trees. But if you have trees growing, and for instance, if you had some pine trees growing that were not really thick, but were more like individual specimen trees, you're going to need to add something to get a total cover over the ground, because the hybrid poplar plantation completely covers the ground with leaf area, and that prevents raindrop impact hitting the soil, and that is what starts erosion. So yeah, there are reasons for growing hybrid poplar if you have other trees, but if you have a really good tree cover, no. Thank you, Lisa. That's the last question I see.
I do know that some of the sites I had seen, Pennsylvania and Ohio, there actually were some minimal vegetation on on some of those sites. But I think the idea was to improve was there. There was Bill McMahon, I said, were the clones adopted suffer from pathogens? And what I would say is that the original clone that was used, yeah, it got canker really bad. The trees were like, just breaking apart and everything else. They all got some, and they also tended to get a lot of cottonwood leaf beetles. But the OP367, there's never really saw much problem with cankering, Septaria canker. So, which was one reason why it was more desirable as well. And you're right, it's not just about height, diameter, it's about susceptibility to disease as well. I didn't mention that, but that's a good point.
I just got another question from Lisa. Do you suggest co-planting grasses with the trees? Anytime you have steep slopes, I would suggest using grasses to help stabilize the slopes. They'll pop out in about 14 days and begin to root and begin to stabilize the slopes. But the issue with grasses is they like to have nitrogen, and this deep row doesn't let the grasses get their roots down to the nitrogen. So you would have to think about supplemental fertilization if you add grasses in on a mine spoil that's essentially sterile.
Yeah, a lot of times what happens too is, I mean, just things seed in on their own very quickly. It's amazing how quickly they do come in.
And that would be one of the advantages of grasses. They would outcompete seeds once you get the grasses established.
And again, I didn't see a lot of herbicides being used on the site we worked on or the other sites, but I think you would want to keep the probably like 2 or 3 feet around the trees cleared of vegetation. That would be ideal.
I guess one of the reasons that I'm not jumping up and saying, yeah, plant grasses everywhere, is that we saw here that we had very little surface runoff. Even though the soil was pretty heavy, it was pretty much a clay, but we had enough vegetation on the soil and we had enough tree cover that we didn't get much runoff. Off of the experimental plots, we didn't get any runoff. After the second year, we began to develop trenches between each row where the biosolids had been dewatered by the roots, and then because of that, the biosolids collapsed and there was a 6 or 8 inch deep trench between them, and that pulled enough water in that runoff just never occurred. And so we had these lumps of ponds, little ponds with 1 row width apart, that were holding water all over the place. If you're familiar with the term golgoys, that's a naturally occurring pond that occurs up in Minnesota, among other places. We had the same thing here, only they were really oblong. Other questions or comments? Bernie, it's been really nice to have you here talking about the experience you've had. I appreciate it. Well, I don't see any reason to continue and hold you here if you don't have other things you want us to look at.
I agree. So we will be, this will be recorded and posted, and we'll let you know when that is. And at the next webinar that Gary, I think, will be doing the majority of that. We'll also have a evaluation, ask you to fill out after we're done there. So thank you very much for attending, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you all, and good night.